Today we are joined by Mr. David Avery. He's a CDT and technician, and he's going to be discussing with us DESS components. Today's session is DESS, a strong foundation for reliable restoration. A few things to keep in mind before we get started. This is meant to be interactive, so if you do have any questions, please indicate them in the questions panel on your toolbar. At the end of our session, we will have time for Q&A live with David. And with that, I'll pass it to you, David. Welcome.
Thank you, Madeline, and welcome everyone to this session of Quick Bites. I love this concept. It's short, sweet, and to the point. We're going to be talking about DESS as an implant company today, and I will tell you that as I have been doing my research to further prepare for these comments today, I am phenomenally impressed with DESS. They have been at this for a long time. They have a very, very strong European presence, as the best implant companies do, and of course, origin in Spain. But fantastic team and unbelievable array of products and very, very high quality. So let's get started. So in doing that research, these are the kinds of things that I'm looking for when I'm considering making purchases and working with systems myself. And that is most importantly that this is a very, very comprehensive company. Their engineering and manufacturing is second to none. I did change the script on the second point here where the screwdriver tip is concerned, because lots of times when you're buying screws and abutments and products, as the manufacturers of other systems would call it off-label, essentially you find different screw configurations as far as the drivers, and there's a tremendous amount of confusion that ends up happening between the laboratory and the clinician. And I'm happy to report that these people are very, very smart, and they make sure that the tip of that screwdriver that fits into their screws is exactly the same as the parent company that they're loading to. So I'm very impressed with that. They've gone to a lot of trouble to make things seamless. And the engineering, the quality of fit, their internal adaptation to the internal hexes and so forth is really very, very good. It's done at the highest level in dentistry. They have a very comprehensive line of products, everything that we need in the contemporary laboratory, from angled abutments, from angled screw channels to scan bodies, and scan bodies specific to the type of abutment that you're using as well. So very comprehensive, very well thought out, and again, FDA certified and recognized and held standards as well for Canada and so forth. And so they've really touched all the bases and done everything they need to do to keep us comfortable with what we're producing in our laboratories. And by the way, at a significant savings. So I want to present about 20 minutes of material for you that I have been presenting and updating for about 15 years now, literally. Because in my years at Drake, the 30 years I spent there, and since the 6 years that I've spent consulting with laboratories around the country in all aspects of their business, whether it be operational, one end to the other, to sales, to technical training, and so forth. I really find that we all suffer from problems with clinicians and cases that get surgically completed without any consultation with us in the laboratory, and therefore we end up, as we like to say, holding the bag, and the bag is not always pleasant. So I tongue-in-cheek say that the trouble begins when the patient's bottom hits the chair, and their comment is, "I hate my denture, I don't care what it costs, money is no object, I want fixed." And in my mind, and I don't mean to be detrimental to the surgical specialist out there, but that just means that sometimes people get lost a little bit in the sales opportunity and don't do thorough planning and treatment planning. And in my mind, thorough treatment planning cannot exist without the laboratory's input and involvement. One of the coolest things in my entire career was many, many years ago when the Bradmark fixture first hit the country. I was called by a prosthodontic client of mine and asked to go to lunch with an oral surgeon to look at x-rays and talk about models for a surgery. And that was in the beginning, because that's the way European laboratories and European clinicians operate. They operate as a team. And this particular aspect of our processes in the implant-based segment really brings us more to the table and makes us more critical. And so when these kinds of things occur and I get a maxillary edentulous arch with 12 implants in it, I jokingly call that a boat payment. So it really needs to be prosthetically driven. It's what's been taught and trained from the very beginning of implant dentistry in North America. And that means we need to know where we're going if we have a chance of getting there successfully. And so really looking at the prosthetics, the position of teeth for functional, for phonetic and aesthetic purposes has to be determined before surgery to really ensure that we get a great outcome. And this slide is really intended for you technicians out there to share this with your clients. And so there will be a PDF of this lecture available through Zahn, and you can reach out to them to get it. But I can tell you right now that this is something that I learned from experience from a prosthodontist many years ago. And my statement that adequate existing maxillary dentures offer a lot of information couldn't be more true. When I say adequate, I mean a denture that has, and we're really speaking maxillary here, that has proper anterior tooth possession for phonetics, aesthetics, and so forth, and a reasonable close proximity to the patient's real VDO. If there's loss of VDO, it has to be considered. But that denture at that initial appointment, as you're going to see, can give us a lot of input as to what can be done for that patient. So important question one, it's the all important question one. Do we require a labial flange for this maxillary edentulous arch? And the point I'm making is that if you measure the denture tooth, and I'm sorry about my photograph, but actually I'm measuring the thickness of the denture tooth as it emerges from the acrylic. And if it is 3 millimeters or less, we can do a fixed restoration. But I can tell you that classically it is not. It is classically 4 millimeters or more, which means an overdenture, and many times, as I'll show you in a moment, it's 8 or 9 millimeters facial. And we need a flange to get proper lip support and cleansability. And here I'm illustrating from a prosthodontic text talking about anatomy and the labial surface of maxillary incisors being a full 8 to 10 millimeters anterior to the incisive papilla. And what we so often see, as I'm illustrating with this particular case, is that the labial ridge is actually even with or palatal to the incisive papilla in cases that have been edentulous for a long period of time, because of the fact that that labial, that buccal flange, if you will, that buccal plate that surrounds incisors is paper thin. And once those teeth are lost, if there is not a graft done to retain position and hopefully implants placed very early to keep the bone from absorbing, this is what we end up with. And if we do a fixed case on this case, this patient's going to have a horrific time keeping it clean because we have to ridge lap the surface significantly. And it is being done every day in this country to the tunes of thousands of times a day because of people's desire for fixed dentistry when they're really not indicated clinically to have it. The important question number two that then puts us into a position of discussing what type of retainers we're going to use is what vertical restorative space is available. And so restoration really needs to be based on the patient's anatomy, and I'm saying in parentheses, existing or surgically available space, which means, of course, when we do fixed detachables, most of the time we're going in and removing anywhere from 6 to 8 to 10 millimeters of bone to create vertical space to do those restorations, not taking into account the anterior ridge position. And so illustrated here is what I do. I take the existing denture, if it's got reasonable vertical dimension and the plane of occlusion is good, I will measure at the marginal ridge between the second line and the first molar with a Bully gauge. And if I get 7 millimeters, I know that I can do a stud or a radicular retained case. But I'm telling you that the average ridge height to the occlusal surface is 5 to 6 millimeters, which, by the way, is the dimension that we build maxillary occlusion rims to. And the reason for that is that's the absolute average position of the posterior occlusal table in human beings. If we're at 10 millimeters, which we almost never are in absence of trauma, we can do all kinds of things. And we're going to go through each one of these categories briefly. So if we do not have an adequate existing denture to measure, and the patient's denture is severely worn or perhaps without an appliance, we have to do a setup and confirm occlusion, phonetics, and aesthetics to make sure that we know exactly where we're going with that new setup. This was an example of a case that I did for a client of mine that had a patient that came in, had never worn a maxillary denture, and insisted upon having a fixed case. The guy was a gold miner, believe it or not, in North Carolina, and he had just sold a bunch of gold to have this dentistry done. You will notice, by the way, that his mandibular arch is almost completely intact, and this is exactly the chronology of tooth loss, by the way. Many of our maxillary dentures, the majority of our maxillary dentures, are usually done against mandibular arches with some combination of remaining mandibular anterior teeth. But this was done so that he could try it in for the patient. And when the patient saw the spaces of the position of the teeth and he showed it in the mirror, he said, "Is this what you want?" And he said, "No." He said, "You can't have fixed." And it became clear to the patient because the patient didn't believe him, didn't believe me. They were only going to believe what they could see with their own eyes. So this is a great way to illustrate to them that they can't have what they think they want. So again, in that stud radicular category, we know that locators are the most widely used attachment in the world for this kind of case. They are not always the best attachment. These Delrin to metal relationships, especially where implants are concerned, do provide some nice shock absorbency and allow some loading of the soft tissue to minimize the amount of stress placed on the fixtures themselves. But they can be abused. In many cases, we're really struggling for any vertical space. And so as you can see, we've got the Equator here from Ryan 83, which has been around for a long time now. And there are many, many cases over the years that I've had to go to this just to pick up another 2 millimeters of space so that the acrylic in the teeth didn't fracture on top of this with the denture. One important point to make here is that when patients do have one of those two attachment systems, it is very important that the clinician include a water pick in the cost of the case so that patients have it and don't have to buy it as an additional item, because it is very, very hard to keep the inside of those tiny attachments clean in the mouth with a toothbrush. And so I've found this from personal experience in doing 100 cases with a surgeon in Charlotte over a period of 2 years. And patients chronically get plaque built up inside these attachments. So this is another great tip for you to share with your clinicians. I am an absolute insistent about doing these maxillary horseshoe frameworks for these cases that are going to be locator or bar retained in the maxillary arch, because it allows us to make a very thin and strong palate and also reinforces the strength of the denture and minimizes microfractures around the position of the attachment. This only adds, less than a couple $100 in the average lab to the cost of a case that's going to go to the patient for about $14,000. So to me, it's a little absurd that doctors would skip this step. Even if you do it submerged and it's less expensive, it's important to have that metal. For cad-cam bar supported overdentures, I'm showing an illustration here that you saw earlier when we talked about the labial ridge. And what I'm really emphasizing here is that I have been taught a long time ago that if you are planning a removable case, it's a better idea to do a pair of bilateral bars with locators either tapped and threaded into it or extended off the mesial and the distal. It allows us to reduce the vertical height required for the case. It also allows us to spread the attachments out more like a coffee table versus a bar stool. I've never fallen off of a coffee table, but I may have fallen off of a bar stool or been knocked off by one of you that are actually listening to this program. But nevertheless, this makes this case much easier to manage. It also prevents putting any bulk between 7 and 10 so that the denture base can be kept thin and we can have normal phonetics for lingual contours of the denture. That's the most important part about this. These two bars splint those implants in areas of bone that we all know can be questionable, but it splints them for strength and stability and leaves the anterior region clear. At 10 millimeters, I have fixed detachable here, which we have been taught in the science that we need 14 to 15 millimeters to do fixed detachable restorations. screwed down dentures, if you will. And what it really boils down to is that titanium is not as strong as many of us think it is, and cobalt chrome is significantly stronger, 30 to 35% stronger. And so we can do this at 10 millimeters with a cobalt chrome framework because we can reduce the height of that framework by 30% and give ourselves more vertical room instead of having to be so aggressive with the surgery to reduce bone for delivery. The biggest thing that I think has come to us other than cad-cam technologies in the last 10 years has been the angled screw channels. And DESS Angle Base is a fantastic product. It allows us to correct angulation up to 30 degrees. And we all know that this becomes ultra crucial in the anterior of these cases in the maxillary arch, because the long axis of available bone is going to bring that screw hole directly out of the fixture right through the facial of our incisors. And so this allows us to change that angulation so that we end up ideally in the cingulum of the anterior teeth. And this, of course, applies to bridge work, fixed detachables, full arch zirconia restorations, and even single anterior crowns. This has allowed us to really stay in a cementable situation with doctors for screw retention at the chair. And the last thing, of course, is full contour zirconia. And this has really become the industry standard for excellence and high quality. Zahn has fantastic zirconia materials for milling these restorations. We now have multiple layers to work with, and many of the top clinicians in the world are no longer veneering porcelain to these restorations for incisal translucency and aesthetics, but are doing these to full contour with pre-staining and then final characterization at the end with the Mio product, which has proven to be amazing for zirconia and for lithium disilicate. So at the end, we want to talk about, again, the fact that the regulatory aspects of the DESS system all meet criteria that need to be met for us. There's been a lot of concern in the North American market about FDA compliance and not getting off label and not ending up being liable for something as a laboratory if there's an issue. So those bases have all been touched here. And then also this is something that I'm very familiar with talking about, because I have spent many years consulting with and teaching for another company in the US that is a very large manufacturer of abutments and bars and so forth. And quite honestly, we know that as long as the manufacturer has followed all the guidelines that need to be accomplished for FDA registration, we are in good shape. And then secondly, the extended warranty from DESS on the components and the implant that it is placed on if the manufacturer refuses to honor the warranty because you used components other than theirs. I think we are well past that period. I almost refer to it as paranoia, but it is sales method. It's a way for implant manufacturers to do everything they can to ensure that they're going to get component sales, because quite honestly, that's where the money is. That's where the profit is for all these companies, including DESS. So the reality is that these components match any implant system that they go on top of extremely well, and they've actually taken steps to enhance the quality of that fit better than some other companies. So I will tell you that warranty is non-issue. A lot of my colleagues just insist on staying on label. But I found in my experience at Drake that that can also create a lot of admin problems, because if you're dealing with 4 different implant companies and you've got abutments and components coming from all kinds of different places, it can become very time consuming and very labor intensive to keep up with it from an admin standpoint. I want to close with just a couple of seconds on the Foundation for Dental Laboratory Technology. As a board member, I'd like to thank Zahn for their continuous support of the foundation, and it is my great hope that all of you listening to this, either today or later in a recording, if you're not involved in contributing to the foundation, I hope you will consider doing so. We have done some fantastic work and continue to bring educational content of the highest caliber to our laboratory colleagues. including scholarships from Spear, from COIS, on and on. We've really gotten great support from the educational continuums out there in offering scholarships and making it possible for people to really be able to excel and increase their career capabilities through the foundation. So I hope you'll consider that.